Welcome back to episode 5 of the International Web Effectiveness Podcast, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and techniques necessary to improve your web presence and manage global websites. In our last episode, we discussed the reasons for implementing a global web center of excellence. In this episode, we're going to get into the root causes of web project failures. But before we get into that, Google did a search off the record with Martin, Lizzie, and Gary on internationalization and hreflang tags. It's interesting that we had crickets for years, and in the last month, Google spoken officially about ccTLDs and hreflang. What are your thoughts on that, Bill? Did you get a chance to see it?
I did. Yeah, I listened to it and I thought it was fascinating. And I recommend anybody that does anything internationally listen to it because, first off, I love that Google's now really trying to address this
Yeah.
and get ahead of it because for a lot of people, it's a big problem. The thing and why I think people should listen to it, especially people that aren't necessarily hreflang or international search practitioners, I think web people should listen to this because one of my big takeaways is just the dialogue between the Google folks about what they know or don't know or how they interpret it or don't interpret it. I thought that was really good. And there's a few other things that I'll cover. I'm writing sort of trying to paraphrase some of this and some takes because I thought it was fascinating on where one, they talk about something we've talked about before is, the benefits of each method. And they talk specifically around where in their hierarchy and process is it ingested? Where do they encounter it? And they're actually very candid dialogue about, what they do at phases. I mean, they don't go into great detail, but there's enough that people that understand how this works that, anyway, I thought it was very interesting. The other one I thought that was good that they talked about is trying to get clarity around, this scoring idea. So they talk about this algorithm called, and I'm paraphrasing, essentially language demotion, country promotion. And Gary reiterated this idea around ccLDs only given really marginal benefit and going as far as saying in the future. Now, he didn't say next week, next month, next year, 10 years from now, but he felt that the way things are going, that ccTLDs having any real value going away. And he did sort of couch that within because so many country domains like .co for Colombia, .tv, and many others have been sort of co-opted into essentially becoming global TLDs. And so as that happens, or we'll have people, despite nature of being in this example for Martin, where he's in Germany, he set up his site on a DE just because that's what his hosting company had, and then went into the fact that all of his content was in English. So what does Google do with that? And I think they also talk about this from an implementer point of view, why you should leave some things out. And yeah, just a whole bunch of things that I've not really heard them say in this format. Now, I've heard some sort of sidebar conversations, but I thought it was really good. And it's like 30 some minutes. So take a listen. And then when you're done, maybe head over, we'll comment in our Facebook group. But I'm also going to try to call a bunch of these things out that I thought was extremely interesting.
Well, I'm looking forward to that article. You always have a great grasp of big ideas, and I'm sure you bring a great conversation to the table. All right. Bill, you recently wrote an interesting article on the root causes of failure and an experience that you had with an observation as to why the team had failed the audit. Could you give the listeners some background on that and what you learned?
Yeah, it was many, many years ago when I was in the Marine Corps. I was part of a group, broke it up into three different areas. And one of the areas we had a Marine Corps level inspection or audit, and they failed. And in the audit, they actually said it was the worst they'd ever seen anywhere in the Marine Corps. And for the people in charge, that's like a kiss of death. In the civilian world, you would get fired, and so they didn't fire the big guy in charge. They did fire a bunch of other people or relieved them, sent them other places. And I was reading this, and I was, I call it the kiddie table. I was very junior, but I was curious. And I'm reading this document and I get nudged in the ribs. And the guy, the CO, he's sort of ranting. And, as all of us know, when the big dog is ranting, they want your full attention. And so he asked me, was I boring him or is he boring me? And I told him I was really curious why they failed so bad. And he said, well, because they're incompetent. And I said, well, why are they incompetent? And I was always taught as a kid to try to get to diagnose things, not troubleshoot things and get to the root cause. And so he's like, well, so what did you find? And I said, look, I saw four things. Number one was people lacked knowledge and training. They cited specific cases where entries, and what they're doing is in the Marine Corps and all the military, it's just like HR. You have a record book of all the things you've done, training, awards, certification, your payroll records, all that's in this folder. And there's specific things that have to be in there, specific entries that must be made. And when they saw these hadn't been done, they asked people, why didn't you do it? Why wasn't this in here? And in many cases, like they didn't know.
Yeah.
This is their job, but they didn't know this was supposed to be there. And I gave a couple examples in the article, but if we flip this over to search and the web, this would be the equivalent, and it's sort of in a way a false equivalent, because to a developer that needed to say do a redirect, there might be 5 or 6 ways a developer can move a user from old page A to new page B. And they all do that, move somebody from A to B. But only one of those methods really works well for search. So whose problem is that when the search person comes in and said, hey, we've got 25,000 improperly done redirects? It's a redirect getting somebody to A to B, but properly is the key phrase. They were unaware that this one method, which may be even harder for them to implement, was better for somebody else. So again, it's sort of a false equivalency, but the idea is the person doing their job didn't know, and that's either because they're unprepared, unaware, or untrained. And this can lead to delays. It can lead to wasted resources. And you always find this when people take a long time to do something, it's because they're trying to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
And so that was the first one that I saw. And if I look back over my career, a lot of times I find people haven't done things or aren't doing things mainly because they've never been trained. And especially in this world of search and development and web effectiveness that we're talking about. The second thing I saw was that there was a difference in opinion and disagree with the rule. And in this particular use case, this particular unit, we were sort of what we would call tip of the spear. And because we never knew if we were going to be in one place long enough, we were exempt from rifle and pistol qualification. Now, you can imagine as a Marine, there's two things that are really important in the Marine Corps: physical fitness and rifle qualification. So if you don't do well or don't have updated scores on either of them, it's highly likely you're not going to get promoted. Now, what was happening is 100% of all the records didn't have an entry that said they're exempt from rifle requalification while they're in this unit, which meant that the score would go back to their previous score. Without the entry and without the computer entry that goes along with it, it looks like the user is either unqualified or doesn't have a score, negatively affecting their promotion. And so when they asked the people, why aren't you making these entries? And they said, well, the boss, the department head, didn't want to do all these signatures. He didn't want to sign it. And so he was kicking the can down the road, and I'll sign it when they leave. Because they sort of have to, which meant that the average person might go 6 to 9 months to a year without this entry. And this is because this person decided not to follow this rule. And that's exactly what it is. And I've seen this a lot when I've done audits. Whenever I've done a web effectiveness audit, I've developed questions pretty much for each role. The first thing I'll do is give me all the roles that make up your web, anybody that touches something that hits the glass. And then I tend to do 2 or 3 interviews. I interview the manager and 1 or 2 doers. And then I also read any requirements. And what I find is the requirements say you're going to do X, Y, and Z. The manager says, yes, my team does X, Y, and Z. And then you talk to the doers and they're like, we do ABC.
Yeah,
because it's
I need to
or
stop you
whatever.
there. So I actually have experience. I was a trainer in an engineering organization, and I had to put the whole, it was a manufacturing facility, through a 3-day training. So we broke it up into groups of 20 people and ran them through. And I was a product manager, and I ended up getting tasked to do this. I ended up working with the guy who was the person who put together Ford number one, I think it was, Benny Kesco. Anyway, it it was amazing to me what people thought the processes were that other people were supposed to do. Like someone would say it was Bill's job to do this and then give it to me. And then Bill would say, I give it to them and they do that job. And so no one was doing the job.
Mm.
And it was so ridiculous. There was things like order intake. It just shows my age. We had a 6 or 7 page carbon copy document. It was all, handwritten. The last page you couldn't even read. And one of the biggest problems the company had was actually getting shipments out on time. And it was because we learned that it took almost 50% of the time to get the order entered. Like
Yeah.
it had to have engineering, they had to order materials, they had to put it into development, and then it had to go through cutting and welding and blah, 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 painting. 50% of the time was taken up in the order entry process because things would sit on people's desk. The last guy who got the last page couldn't even read it.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't going to sign anything. And what would
Right.
happen was the engineering manager would be held accountable for the delivery, and he'd run back to the financial guy and say, "Can you please sign us?" And so he would sign it because the customer was all worried and whatever. But
Mhm.
yeah, I see a lot of the same things in my consulting as well, where people don't know what other people do or what they're supposed to do or why it was done. Things like somebody fixes something. There's no documentation. How many times do you see no documentation? That's like the kiss of death.
Yeah.
Somebody fixes something, 6 months later, somebody new comes in and undoes it.
Yeah. No, it's pretty common. I mean, this is exactly it. And I think your point is definitely spot on that, when was the last time anybody looked at the process? Like, I hate using the term best practices because then that's like etched in stone, and it's like, no, it's our procedures. This is our methodology. And is anybody ever checking it? And that's the interesting thing when I do the readouts. Like, I try to not throw anybody under the bus, say, hey, Steve said that they don't even follow that direction. But I try, and then I'll often ask them, hey, can I sort of reveal this that nobody at this level is doing it that way? And sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes they'll say no, or don't use my name. It's like, well, you're the only one that does it. So they'll know who said that. But another really interesting case, like, press hard enough to get through the last page, some of the directions or the indicator that this piece needed to be SEO, have SEO or paid search or any of the thoughts of that was on the back of a document. And same thing, when people were distributing it, they were going to the copier, photocopying only the front. And same thing to this, the person had no idea that they had ticked the box it needed to be optimized or things like that. So the moral of this story is really, understand which it is. Do they not know? Do they disagree with the process? Do people understand the process, the end to the end chain? And then along with this was number three is a lack of collaboration and coordination. And in this particular use case, what it was, like I mentioned, there's certain things that Marines have to do in order to get promoted. And some of that is different training, like the physical fitness test, as well as certifications for their jobs, certifications for the rank they're at, correspondence courses. And I saw the inspector, they actually came back from training with a bunch of folders and just started opening record books looking to see, was this certification entered into the record book? Was there physical fitness test? And it was nope, 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 nope. And it turned out that none of that information was being given to this department from training because they didn't want to lose that because their inspection required them to have those copies. And so it was I'm going to put, these are mine. I'm not going to let them out of my sight. And a simple question is, well, can you make a photocopy? Or the resolution of this was they come into the mailroom, they come in like the certificates for training come in a specifically colored envelope. Let's open it in the mailroom. Let's photocopy it. Let's put the original back to the training and then give the copy to the admin guys to put in the record book. And it was just interesting with this. I think it's the same thing, we have in search, is that we're at the mercy of everybody else. And we've talked about this before. Oftentimes, like a global SEO may only own a KPI and process and not have any way to impact the creative, the content, the templates, the creativity. And so you're at the mercy of the collaboration and coordination with other people. And then the fourth one, and so that was the example that I gave. And all this is, remember, I'm standing up sort of scared to death because here's this big boss and I'm a nobody, and trying to explain this process. And then the fourth one was, and really it's the most important of all. And I said, these three things I just described, they only occurred because there was no oversight or governance. There was no check. There was no, like I gave you an example, when I checked into the unit, we have what's called a check-in sheet, and you're supposed to go to all these people, these different departments. They're supposed to do certain checks, do certain things, and then they initial it. And when you're all done, you give this to your boss to show that you've done the round robin of everything. And when I checked into this admin group, the guy felt like I had interrupted him. He took my record, threw it into a box, and then initialed my sheet, and I was on my way. A lot of the things that they're supposed to check are things like my insurance form, all things that if it were missing, I could sign it immediately. I could answer a question immediately. I could tell them if I got married before I checked in, or divorced, or any of those things. So that wasn't done at the point of introduction. At no point was anything being checked. At no point was training making sure that we were entering, I wasn't part of this team. And so I said, all four of these things can be corrected. And the scariest thing about all this is this colonel looks at me and he goes, great, sounds like a plan, make it happen. And, basically had 30 days to fix this, to basically review and change the process, train the people, and audit, almost 3,000 of these records, where almost every one of them had something wrong with it. And so when I gave them my game plan, the first thing they asked me, like at the end of the first day, how many did you audit? I'm like, we audited 0, because we can't audit anything until we train the people. We can't audit anything until people understand the process. We can't audit anything until we have an audit protocol. And to them, in their mind, was simply start looking at stuff, start correcting stuff. And even more interesting is when I gave him my written plan, I asked him, and this is a big lesson I learned that we'll talk about in a future episode, is I asked him, what does he think success is? And he said, I really don't care. Your only metric for success that I don't get fired. Because that was it. If he couldn't correct this in the 30 days, if it was still defective at an unsatisfactory rate, he's in charge and he would be relieved. And that would be a kiss of death for this person's sort of 23-year career at this point. And so the pressure on me was pretty intense to try to fix this. And I'm like number 8 in the food chain in terms, like I'm nobody. There were people that I was telling what to do that were 2 and 3 ranks ahead of me, above me. But yet I was tasked with this. And it would just, from that day, I've never forgot to think of these 4 things. And I've been able to attribute it to probably 100% of every project I've ever looked at, why it failed. It's these. And then we'll throw in a bonus one, because I'm sure somebody's saying, well, what about lack of resources, lack of budget? We can throw in a 5th one, just call it lack of. You can insert a lack of, but all of these, I would say, if I had to bundle that would be lack of prior planning. Is probably the biggest reason projects fail. But once you have a project, we're hoping that we've sort of got some of these things wired in, and it breaks down to one of these 4, and most likely 4 of 4 if you don't have any oversight or governance.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. We hope you're enjoying our conversations as much as we love bringing them to you. If you like what you hear, we would really appreciate it if you could take a moment and rate our podcast. Your ratings help us reach more listeners and keep the show going. Just head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts and give us a 5-star rating. Let us know what you think in a review section. It only takes a few seconds, but it makes a huge difference for us. Plus, we love hearing your feedback. Thanks so much for your support. So I really like what you talked about, where when you first start, you go in and you start interviewing people like that. I guess that goes back to the way you handle the problem, where let's not, start ticking boxes. Let's make sure people know what the process is. The first way you do that would be to interview people. So could you talk a little bit more about that? What are the top 5 things someone should do, even if they're not new?
Well, number one is just, break it out by role, because every role is different. And I'm going to tell you, we'll save it, but there's a reason why I started doing this, and we'll save it because I think that whole interview process is really important. But it's an interesting story of why I started to do it. Think about the questions I always have on here. Why? And you got to come up with the right nuance of why do we do things the way we do them? And you got to say that with the right inflection, because otherwise people are thinking you're automatically questioning what you're doing. And goes back to our discussion on URLs. Why do we, and I always try to use we. Why do we structure our URLs this way? And it's not accusatory, it's not critical, it's just curiosity. And then if you ask that question, now you can ask that question only to the web dev team because the content people don't know. Search people may or may not know. It's not their responsibility. So I ask questions for each. One question I always ask is, what's your view on SEO? What's your view on your workflow? What is the process for getting things onto the glass? And it's like you said, well, I do this and I give it to Sally, and Sally gives it to Steve after she puts in her piece, and Steve does something with it. And then Steve sends it to Bangalore, and Bangalore puts it on the web, and it comes, and just trying to ask each constituency how things get to the glass. And what I mean is, somebody can see it when they go to that page.
Yeah,
I think that's the most revealing question you can ask every person in the food chain. And I think I've only had one occurrence where that response was fairly similar across every role that I ask it of.
Wow.
And it's to your point with, when you were doing the training and either they didn't have process or nobody knew what happened after they handed off to somebody. I find that if people can understand the full process, they're more likely to be able to understand either how they can perfect something, what their contribution is added to or taken away from, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big one. But really, if you can uncover, and I think this is probably the biggest mistake search people make, is sort of kicking in the door and starting to present audit findings before you understand why people have done anything that they do. Because that immediately comes off as condescending. It immediately, you have no empathy at that point.
You're not making friends.
You're not making friends. You've just ostracized everybody in the room.
Yeah.
Whereas imagine if you ask them, even if you know why they do what they do, you can see it. That's the beauty of SEO in many cases, is you can look at a page and know what people are doing without hearing a word. You can visualize how things are assembled and constructed and who does what. But just simply asking them that question, you'll find it's like, oh, okay, maybe I need to soften this. And then the other things too, when you do this interviews, you start to understand where their points of failure are, their barriers.
Yep.
The last guy in the food chain you talked about, he's like, I can't read the damn copy. It's not legible. So maybe we type it. Maybe we use a better ballpoint pen. Maybe we just tell people to press harder. Maybe we move into the current century and we input this stuff.
We ended up eliminating half the copies because half the people didn't do anything with it but sign it.
Exactly.
And they would go on vacation, and so it would sit on their desk for a week. It was
Exactly.
totally ridiculous. Totally ridiculous.
Exactly. And you can find that out.
Before I forget this thought, one of the things I thought worked really well during these interview questions was do it with two people. So one can actively listen and one can talk and
Yep.
drill into questions. And then those two people can have another conversation afterwards and you uncover some more stuff. And part of this quality, it was total quality management was the program. One of the things that really, really worked was don't send any defects, don't accept any defects. So once you know what your job is and you pass on your work, and if they see a defect, they just say, hey, you missed something. And it reinforces them to fix it. It's like, I think today, people try to get stuff done and they just take it with errors and they fix it themselves.
Right.
And once you start taking, like you said, someone can see these little things that they can do that can make a big impact in the end.
And I think that's good, passing the feedback back, because then people can learn. And there's cases where if you're fixing all these, then somebody would say, well, if you'd have told me that you're spending 20 minutes fixing stuff every time, then I could have changed the process upstream. And little things, a real quick story from Disney. When I was checking into Disney once to do a keynote at their event, the lady checking me into their hotel was really frazzled because they said, you must get the people's big sign right there, post-it note over her terminal. You must get the email. And somebody had designated that was the number one thing you had to get from everybody checking in was an email, but it was 8 screens deep. So she's like tab, 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 tab to get to the screen with the email, and then tab, 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 tab to get back out. And then there was something else she had to tab 3 in for to put some entry. I'm like, have you ever fed this back to anybody that, why can't they put that right on the entry screen? And she's like, I didn't think I could. I'm like, at least tell your boss, because look at you, there's 10 of you in this queue, in front of these queues, people are frustrated, they want to get in, and you're tab, 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 tab 8 times. And so exactly that. And I know you're good at that, telling me that, because I've got a bad habit of just editing things without, explaining that, like on our show notes and stuff that, hey, no, this is how we should, mention things and stuff like that. So I think feeding that back is really good. And that feedback loop, Japanese call that Kaizen, which is this, continuous improvement. And so, if you're frustrated by something, if people are doing things repetitively, can we find a way to remove that from the workflow? Because imagine if we could eliminate 5 minutes of frustration at 3 points in a workflow, that's 15 minutes that we recover.
Yeah.
That we can apply to something else.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. You want to have any, thoughts you want to give people?
Well, I want to, sort of tease next week, because I think we had on our agenda, we started talking about this feedback loop is another great way, what we would label, and I think we're calling it creative methods for increased budget, where, it's a help me, help you type scenario, that if you're trying to get increased budget, one of the tips, and not to give them all away, is, can you piggyback off somebody else's work? So like you were talking about, can maybe the final person in the chain, if they're inputting all this, can we move that to the front of the chain? Can we have them input something up front? And if you did that, then basically you're taking your resource time and essentially giving it to somebody else, which frees up your resource time, whether that's resources or actual budget. So yeah, we want to talk about 4 or 5 of those. And I think it flows perfectly out of this, collaboration and teamwork and understanding and process. Are some very interesting ways that if you really understand your process and workflow, you can use that either to piggyback off somebody else's resources or use that barrier or that challenge as a way to support additional resources and budget for your team.
I want to remind people of our free Facebook group, where we use that as an opportunity to discuss these things, and you can ask any questions you want. You can also suggest ideas for upcoming podcasts. You can find that by searching International Web Mastery Free Group. Bill, I think this was a really good conversation. Thanks again. Always informative. I learn something every time I speak with you.
I do as well. Looking forward to the next one.
Okay, take care. Bye. Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying hreflang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there.